Just before dawn in the Caribbean, a U.S. helicopter hovered over an oil tanker, and with that moment, Washington sent one of its clearest signals yet that its confrontation with Venezuela is entering a far more dangerous phase. As vessels are seized, sanctions widen, and the word blockade returns to presidential rhetoric, the Trump administration is no longer merely pressuring Caracas from afar. It is actively reshaping the rules of engagement. In this analysis, we unpack how these latest actions fit into a broader strategy targeting Venezuela's economic lifeline, what they reveal about U.S. intentions toward Nicolás Maduro, and why the stakes now extend well beyond oil and sanctions. The pre-dawn seizure of a Panamanian-flagged tanker carrying Venezuelan oil marks a pivotal escalation in Washington's pressure campaign against Caracas, not only because of what was taken, but because of how and where it happened. On Saturday, U.S. Coast Guard personnel, supported by the U.S. military, boarded and seized the vessel in international waters off the coast of Venezuela. According to a U.S. official familiar with the operation, the tanker was not under U.S. sanctions, its crew did not resist, and its cargo, Venezuelan crude, was ultimately destined for Asian markets. These details matter. Unlike the December 10th seizure of the oil tanker skipper, which had documented ties to Iran and was already sanctioned, this latest operation pushes the boundaries of precedent. It signals that the Trump administration is willing to act not only against sanctioned entities, but also against the broader flow of Venezuelan oil itself, regardless of flag or formal legal status. This action cannot be viewed in isolation. It comes just days after President Donald Trump publicly announced what he described as a total and complete blockade of sanctioned oil tankers entering and leaving Venezuela. While U.S. officials have been careful to frame these moves as law enforcement actions targeting illicit oil trade and narco-terrorism financing, the operational reality suggests something closer to a de facto maritime interdiction campaign. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem's decision to publish a 7-minute video of the operation, complete with a hovering helicopter and dramatic framing, was not accidental. It was political theater, designed to broadcast deterrence. Her language was equally deliberate, linking Venezuelan oil exports to narco-terrorism and framing U.S. action as both justified and necessary for regional security. From a strategic standpoint, the message is clear: Venezuela's oil is no longer merely sanctioned, it is being physically contested. For a country whose economy depends overwhelmingly on crude exports, this represents an existential threat. Years of sanctions have already hollowed out Venezuela's oil sector, leaving infrastructure degraded and production far below capacity despite the country holding the world's largest proven reserves. Much of the remaining output flows to China, often through opaque shipping arrangements designed to evade scrutiny. By intercepting tankers in international waters, the U.S. is effectively warning shippers, insurers, and buyers that Venezuelan oil now carries not just legal risk, but physical risk as well. Legally, the operation sits in a gray zone that Venezuela and its allies are already exploiting rhetorically. Caracas has denounced the seizure as theft and hijacking, while Foreign Minister Yvonne Gill claims the actions violate international law. Iran's swift offer of full solidarity and cooperation, following a phone call between Gill and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, underscores how this maritime pressure campaign intersects with broader geopolitical fault lines. For Tehran, which has faced similar tanker seizures in the past, the precedent is alarming. For Washington, the alignment between Venezuela and Iran only reinforces the administration's narrative that these oil flows fund hostile and criminal networks. Yet beyond the legal arguments and diplomatic outrage lies a deeper strategic calculation. By choosing the sea as the arena for escalation, the Trump administration gains flexibility. Maritime interdictions are less politically costly than immediate land strikes, yet far more coercive than paper sanctions. They squeeze revenue, intimidate partners, and demonstrate military reach without formally declaring war. At the same time, they normalize the presence of U.S. forces in the Caribbean, where thousands of troops, a carrier strike group, and expanded operations have already become part of the landscape. If the tanker seizure represents the visible edge of U.S. power, the deeper structure of Washington's strategy lies in its systematic assault on Venezuela's oil economy. Over the past year, and especially in recent months, The Trump administration has transformed sanctions from a static policy tool into a dynamic campaign designed to choke off every remaining artery of revenue flowing into Caracas. Oil is not just Venezuela's main export, it is the regime's financial backbone, its political leverage, and its last meaningful connection to global markets. By escalating pressure on this sector, the White House is deliberately targeting what it sees as the Maduro government's most vulnerable pressure point. President Trump's declaration of a total and complete blockade of sanctioned oil tankers earlier this week crystallized that intent. While officials have avoided using the language of traditional naval blockades, which under international law can be interpreted as acts of war, the operational effects are increasingly similar. Tankers are being tracked, stopped, and seized. Shipping routes are being disrupted. The psychological impact on international energy traders and insurers may ultimately prove more powerful than the physical interdictions themselves. When vessels risk interception in international waters, even those not formally sanctioned become commercially radioactive. This is especially consequential given the current state of Venezuela's oil industry. Despite possessing the largest proven oil reserves in the world, the country operates far below capacity due to years of mismanagement, brain drain, decaying infrastructure, and layered sanctions. State-owned Petróleos de Venezuela, or PDVSA, controls the sector, but its ability to function as a modern energy company has been deeply compromised. Much of Venezuela's oil now moves through complex and often opaque channels, with China emerging as the primary buyer. These arrangements, frequently involving intermediaries and reflagged vessels, have allowed Caracas to survive, but not to recover. The Trump administration's approach aims to dismantle even this fragile survival mechanism. By publicly linking Venezuelan oil exports to narco-terrorism financing, U.S. officials are not only justifying enforcement actions but also shaping the narrative in advance of potential further escalation. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem's assertion that illicit oil funds criminal activity in the region reinforces a framing that places Venezuela in the same category as transnational threat networks rather than conventional state actors. This rhetorical shift matters because it lowers the political threshold for more aggressive actions in the eyes of the American public. At the same time, Washington has been careful to carve out exceptions that serve U.S. interests. Chevron, the Houston-based energy giant, remains the only American company drilling in Venezuela under a sanctions carve-out that allows it to operate while paying a percentage of its output to PDVSA. This arrangement exposes a central contradiction in U.S. policy. On one hand, the administration argues that Venezuelan oil revenue fuels a criminal regime. On the other, it permits limited U.S. corporate involvement, signaling that the issue is not oil itself, but who controls it. Trump has repeatedly suggested that U.S. access to Venezuelan oil should follow the ouster of Nicolás Maduro, making it clear that energy resources are both a pressure tool and a strategic prize. Caracas, for its part, has responded with defiance rather than concession. Venezuelan officials have condemned the blockade as a reckless and serious threat, framing it as an assault on national sovereignty. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez's announcement that Venezuela will take the issue to the United Nations Security Council and other multilateral bodies reflects a familiar strategy: internationalize the dispute and portray the United States as an aggressor violating global norms. Whether these appeals will gain traction is uncertain, particularly given Washington's veto power and the fragmented state of global consensus on Venezuela. What is undeniable is that the economic vice is tightening. New sanctions earlier this year already strained PDVSA's operations, and the recent vessel seizures add a kinetic dimension that sanctions alone lacked. For Maduro's government, the danger is not immediate collapse, but cumulative suffocation. Every delayed shipment, every wary buyer, and every nervous shipping firm compounds the financial pressure. For the Trump administration, this layered strategy offers a way to escalate without crossing, at least rhetorically, into open war. As maritime seizures and oil sanctions intensify, the Trump administration's broader objective toward Venezuela is coming into sharper focus, not merely containment, but transformation. While officials continue to insist that their actions are aimed at countering drug trafficking and terrorism, the cumulative pattern of military strikes, economic warfare, and political rhetoric points toward a sustained effort to force a fundamental change in Caracas. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's blunt declaration that the current status quo with the Maduro government is intolerable strips away much of the remaining ambiguity. This is not about marginal behavior correction, it is about breaking an adversarial system that Washington views as irredeemable. The scale of U.S. military activity in and around Venezuela underscores that reality. The administration is now months into an expansive pressure campaign that includes the deployment of thousands of troops, a carrier strike group in the Caribbean, and repeated strikes on suspected drug vessels in both the Caribbean and the Pacific. According to U.S. officials, these operations have destroyed 29 alleged drug boats and killed 104 people. The White House has framed these actions as part of a necessary crackdown on transnational criminal networks funneling drugs and migrants toward the United States. Yet the intensity and frequency of the strikes have drawn serious scrutiny from members of Congress, particularly because they blur the line between law enforcement and undeclared warfare. This ambiguity is not accidental. By operating under the banner of counter-narcotics and national security, the administration has avoided formally committing to regime change, even as senior officials openly suggest that Nicolás Maduro's removal is the real endgame. White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles remarked that Trump wants to keep on blowing boats up until Maduro cries uncle was unusually candid. Rubio's follow-up comments reinforced that sentiment, arguing that the Maduro government not only cooperates with terrorist organizations but actively participates in activities that threaten U.S. national interests. In this framing, Venezuela ceases to be a sovereign state with a hostile government and instead becomes a hub of criminality that must be dismantled. Economic pressure and military action are being reinforced by an expanding web of targeted sanctions. On Friday, the Treasury Department announced a new round of sanctions against Maduro's family members, marking the second such action in as many weeks. These measures follow last week's sanctions on 3 of Maduro's nephews, including the 2 so-called narco-nephews who were granted clemency in October 2022 as part of a prisoner swap involving Americans detained in Venezuela. The inclusion of Carlos Eric Malpica Flores, a nephew sanctioned for his role within the Venezuelan government, and now additional relatives, signals a deliberate strategy. Isolate Maduro personally by dismantling the networks that support him financially and politically. From Washington's perspective, these sanctions serve multiple purposes. They punish loyalty to the regime, deter fence-sitters within the elite, and reinforce the narrative that corruption and criminality are endemic to Maduro's inner circle. State Department officials have emphasized that these individuals are not incidental figures, but pillars of a system that has devastated Venezuela's economy and continues to threaten regional stability. In effect, the administration is attempting to collapse the regime from the inside out while applying relentless pressure from the outside. For Venezuela, the risks are profound. The combination of maritime interdictions, oil revenue strangulation, and the looming possibility of land strikes creates an atmosphere of permanent crisis. President Trump has not ruled out war with Venezuela, and neither he nor Secretary Rubio has committed to informing Congress in advance of potential land operations, an omission that raises serious constitutional and political questions inside the United States. For Caracas, this uncertainty is destabilizing by design. It forces the Maduro government to prepare for multiple contingencies while its economic base erodes. Internationally, the confrontation is reverberating beyond the Western Hemisphere. Iran's offer of cooperation and full solidarity with Venezuela reflects a shared sense of vulnerability to U.S. pressure tactics. China, as the primary buyer of Venezuelan oil, must now weigh the commercial benefits of continued engagement against the growing risk of U.S. interdiction. Each seizure and sanction complicates Beijing's calculus, even if it does not immediately change policy.